I'd like to thank, before I start, Ted Wilson and the committee for asking me to give an overview today on what's going on in Ireland. It's a joint presentation, but Lucy's not coming up here to talk to me. It's most of Lucy Vitkova's PhD work I'm going to present. And before I do, many of you may not be familiar with the situation in Ireland, so I thought it would be useful to just give one slide, a context of why we are where we are. In that at the beginning of the last century there was very little forest cover in Ireland, 1%, following centuries of clearance for agriculture. And then when we got independence in 1922, the state launched an afforestation programme. And due to policy decision at the time to keep good land for forestry, that programme was essentially located on the poorest of soils in peatland areas towards the 1950s. And so we ended up with an estate that has been dominated by Sitka spruce and lodgepole pine. And in that, those new plantations, we tended to follow what you were doing in Britain. So we had the clear fell system, with thinning where appropriate, and then planting by, restocking by planting. And similar, I think, to what has happened here in Britain, things began to change towards the last 2 or 3 decades. One of the most obvious evidence of that was when Coillte, and Coillte is the semi-state body that took over the management of state forests in 1988. So Coillte, as part of its process to look for FSC certification, undertook a public consultation process. And as part of that public consultation process, one of the primary concerns the public expressed was the negative visual impact of clear felling. And around the same time, formal research into CCF began, usually in conjunction with ourselves in University College Dublin and Coillte. ProSilva Ireland then was founded in 2000. Then we had Coillte getting FSC certification in 2001. And then 4 years later, that company adopted a low-impact silviculture policy for its broadleaf woodlands. So that gives you some idea of how we've progressed over the last 10 or so years. So what I wanted to do today, because it addresses the title of the paper or the presentation, is outline what we've been doing for the last 4 years and the last tranche of research in this area. That project is set to finish at the end of August, when Lucy will have her PhD and will be a very valuable potential employee for anybody here who's looking for somebody to take on. There were a number of objectives, and actually the first one, as outlined there, is very similar to what Scott has done here in Britain. We were trying to, for the first time, come up with some idea of the extent of CCF in Ireland, and so we set about constructing a database. We also, on the other hand, wanted to do some sort of an experiment, not least because that would be required for Lucy's PhD. So we were looking at thinning in the context of initiating transformation. And we'd done some work on that before, but it tended to be in older Sitka spruce stands. So we wanted to do it in a young stand. And evolving from actually the first 2 aspects of that work, we decided we'd undertake a survey of foresters' attitudes to CCF. And that yielded some very interesting results. We've also expanded the AFI network, and I won't have time to talk about that today, but most of you have heard from, well, we all attended Phil's field stop there, either today or yesterday. So you know what the AFI is, and you know that we now have 6 or 7 AFI sites in Ireland. And finally, we hope to do some, before the project ends, some work on the economics of clear fell versus CCF. So to look at the current extent of CCF in Ireland, what we did was literally send around a questionnaire to everybody we thought would answer it and more. So it was sent to the foresters within Coillte. We tried to get all registered foresters within the Society of Irish Foresters to reply. We tried to get the owners via the Irish Timber Growers Association and ProSilva Ireland. And the plan was, when we got the database up, that we would visit a proportion of it, a random sample. We hoped for around 10%, to, I suppose, do some sort of ground truthing to see exactly what was going on in these stands. So I'm only going to give you a very small example of the results. Lucy has a paper published on this in Irish Forestry, if anybody wants further details. So basically we have an estimated 10,500, just over 10,500 hectares of CCF. in Ireland, as per this database. That represents around 1.5% of the total forest area. So we're very low relative to what we heard in the first day, and certainly from your statistics earlier on. Much of that is within the public sector, either within Coillte or within the National Parks and Wildlife Service, although there is, I suppose, a sizable private sector involvement at the moment, around 2,500 roughly. And that represents around 271 sites. Some of the data, just the main thing is that they're relatively small. I suppose small is relative. If this was in Austria, these would be very big sites. But typically, most of the properties that CCF was being applied to were less than 20 hectares. More significantly, again down the back, I'm not even sure if you can see this up the front, what we're looking at there is the bulk of them are being managed for less than 15 years. So it's a very recent endeavour. We've lots of information on species, just a summary slide there, that the majority of sites have a mixture of broadleaf conifers, mixtures of broadleaves. It's rarely, or it's less common that it is a pure one species conifer stand or a pure one species broadleaf stand, and I suppose that makes sense. So the plan was to go and visit these sites, so we visited around 10% of them, and to provide some sort of structure to our visit, we adopted Mason and Kerr's information bulletin as to how to assess suitability for transformation. So there was around 30 sites that we visited. We assessed them under a variety of criteria, as I said, coming from Mason and Kerr, as to whether the stand or the site was stable, as to whether we'd good quality stems there, whether there was evidence of browsing, whether we'd need some deer management, whether there was regeneration of the desired species there, whether there was regeneration of other species. So on the basis of those 8 characteristics, we identified that 60%, 59% of the sites we visited had at least 6 of those desirable characteristics. So to summarise what we saw, or what we can say about the extent of CCF in Ireland, it was very obvious from those site visits that it was very much an aspiration. They certainly weren't sites being managed for CCF, even though I used that term earlier on. They were sites that were very much at the beginning stage of transformation. And when you got on those sites, even that was probably a bit aspirational too. There was no evidence of, potential final crop trees, frame trees being identified, or thinning to favour those trees. So it kind of made it clear to us that, as I say, it was a recent endeavour, more aspiration than reality. But at least our site visits identified that the sites that had been designated for CCF had the potential to be transformed. At least quite a number of them had. So that was positive. So as I say, as a result of that, and maybe talking to foresters in Ireland over the last few years, because you're a bit of a I'm safe enough because in academia you can be doing research on something without necessarily having to be totally passionate about it. But I would say for a lot of the foresters who've been involved in it, they've had to face some questions as to why are you using it. So we thought it would be useful to undertake a survey of foresters in Ireland, their attitudes to CCF. So again, this was an online survey, and we tried to access the 500 or so foresters that are registered in Ireland through a variety of routes as outlined up there. We got a 22% response rate, which for surveys is quite good, but we would have liked to have had a higher rate. So all I'm doing here is presenting a selection of some of the things we found from that survey. First of all, a third or so of those that replied were using CCF. And when asked why or what was their main motives for using it, you can see economic benefit and broadleaf management were the 2 answers that they gave, or the 2 most popular answers. Certification and management for amenity and recreation were also given. When asked how much of the forest that they manage under CCF, you can see it's quite a small proportion, and that to some extent confirmed what we'd seen in our earlier work on the database. That those that were using CCF, it represented only less than 10% of the area that they managed, and it was something that they'd only been using quite recently. We had a quarter non-users, so you might be wondering where the other 30% or so disappeared to. Around a third of those that answered were not actually foresters that were managing a forest estate. They were working with the regulatory authority, or they might have been working in forestry extension. So so they wouldn't have been able to answer this particular part of the survey. So a quarter of those were non-users, and it perhaps helps illustrate why they were non-users by providing you with some of the statements that they provided us. And you can see that they weren't convinced of CCF, especially in relation to economics. CCF is not considered as something conventional in Ireland at the moment. The forest blocks are too small, the species are not suited. There was evidence, at least from the foresters, that they felt that the forest owners might be resistant or have resistance to using CCF because they want to generate revenue through clearfell and they want a fast return, and CCF has a stigma of a long-term return. We also presented or asked them, all of those that responded, what they felt were the key constraints to the adoption of CCF in Ireland. And you can see the two ones that came up most commonly were the lack of knowledge amongst foresters about the concept, and indeed concerns about the stability issue and whether CCF is appropriate in high wind risk areas. When asked how those, or if those constraints could be overcome, there was a general agreement that they could be, and certainly in relation to the foresters' knowledge, it was through more research, more training, more education that perhaps those, as I say, constraints can be overcome. In terms of drivers, certification and economics were identified as the primary drivers. Certification is not surprising. We have the same situation as you might have with UCWAS here with our national standard, etc. But economics was interesting, that so many ranked that as a primary driver to the adoption of CCF. We used the last part of the questionnaire to present those surveyed with a variety of statements that we felt reflected our attitudes that we'd heard over the last 4 or 5 years in relation to CCF. So one of the big issues is this uncertainty regarding the economics of CCF versus clear cutting. And so when presented with the statement clear cutting makes more money than CCF in Ireland, over a half agreed, but of interest to us too is the fact that 40% didn't quite know, or unsure as to the answer to that. In relation to the tax issue and forestry in Ireland, you may be or may not be aware that income tax from forestry, or there's no income tax applied to income from forestry. Now that threshold to which that is applied to has declined over the last few years, and currently if you earn more than €85,000 in any 1 year from forestry, then you get tax. So that's seen perhaps as a potential driver in the future to the adoption of CCF, because it's actually inhibiting clear felling, especially in large scale, because of the tax implications. Again, very few were aware of that. In terms of the regularity and the constancy, can't think of the proper word for that, but anyway, the CCF does, it was agreed, provide a more regular and a constant income than clearfell. Just one other example of the statements we put to them was in relation to education and training, in that we asked them, did they feel they had the expertise to practice CCF? And that was equally divided. And what I find the interesting thing about this, even though it's not mentioned there, is that some of those were users, i.e. people who were using CCF, some of them indicated that they didn't have the confidence to use it. So there still is a lack of, I suppose, confidence and experience of applying these techniques. And in terms of the amount of time it would take relative to clearfell, certainly the vast majority did think that CCF would require more of their time. Just to finish up on the last aspect of the work I want to present today, we did initiate, set up a thinning trial in a young Sitka spruce, or in 2 young Sitka spruce stands. We wanted to look at different thinning techniques, in particular graduated density thinning, which our last speaker referred to, and which a number of CCF practitioners in Ireland are using, and in which our same system is being used in Wales and other parts of Great Britain. However, there's very little scientific studies done on that particular method to date. So we set up, as I say, this thinning trial. We looked at 3 different thinning systems. We have our standard thinning that we use in Ireland, our low thinning, and we had extraction racks removed every 7th row with low thinning in between and thin to marginal thinning intensity. We had our crown thinning, and as we all, since yesterday, have become experts in crown thinning, thanks to Jan's, get the name wrong, anyway, thanks to our setup yesterday, we know that we need to mark frame trees in crown thinning, and that's what we did in this thinning trial with extraction racks every 7th row. We identified 200 stems per hectare, and then in generally 2 competitor trees were removed for each of these frame trees. We had a graduated density thinning. Just to illustrate what's involved there, you can see that in the first thinning, in a graduated density thinning, as we applied it, every 8th row was removed as a rack, and then as you moved in from the rack, where's Manus? As you moved in from the rack, you know what that means. You'd 40% of the row adjacent to the rack, and then you'd 20% of the next row, 10% in the next row, and the centre row is left untouched in the first thinning. Next thinning, that centre row is removed, and the reverse happens in terms of the intensity of thinning. So 2 thinning sites, or 2 trial sites in the Midlands, one in the west, or sorry, the east. Pure Sitka spruce year class 22, thinned in 2011 and thinned in 2014. So we have 2 thinning interventions. Within the site, we did a 50 by 50 plot in which we recorded a variety of characteristics that you can see up there. One of the useful things we had, we got access to the field map technology courtesy of the Forest Service and the producers of the field map technology. So we had each individual tree coordinates, which has facilitated and will continue to facilitate a spatial analysis, which is often very useful in this kind of research. Just 2 quick slides showing you, after 2 thinning interventions, some characteristics, the diameter, the height, and the height-diameter ratio. The latter obviously is a useful indicator of stability. So there isn't much to distinguish the systems, the 3 thinning patterns at this stage. We've only, as I say, had 2 thinning interventions. In terms of the volume removed, the most of the volume was taken out in the graduated density thinning in the first thinning intervention. Second thinning intervention, that had fallen somewhat, and crown thinning had removed the greatest volume per hectare. What we hope to do, just to complete, is link in with what Gary Kerr referred to on the first day. Forestry Commission are adapting a single tree standard or single tree model called Moses to Sitka spruce grown in Britain. So we've been using that, or Lucy has been using that with our data from that stand. And what we hope to do is simulate further thinning interventions, maybe 4 or 5 of them. So I'd like to thank the project team, some of whom are here. That's me. You've Paddy Purser's down there, Padraig O'Tooma, you've Phil Morgan is here, and Lucy. And just, am I allowed to do this? The funders are obviously very important, but I just want you to draw your attention to that slide there. I don't know if anybody can see what's happening there. Especially the people that I had walked with today. I was very gingerly walking up that slope, because the last slope I walked up, I fell down, well, nearly did, till Phil Morgan rescued me. So thank you, Phil.